Okay, so today we're taking a deep dive into Lincoln's assassination. But it's not just the assassination itself, We've got excerpts here covering the end of the war and all these conspiracy
It's
theories.
got a real historical thriller feel to it, doesn't it?
It totally does.
Yeah, and what I find so fascinating is how the sources really illuminate not just, the who and how of the assassination, but the why. I
Mm,
mean, this is a pivotal moment in American history, and getting the context right is key.
exactly. I think we all know the basic facts, but I'm sure there's a lot more to uncover here. Like one thing that jumped out at me was just how much tension there was surrounding the war's end. It wasn't just
Mm.
everyone breathing a sigh of relief.
Definitely. The sources really highlight that, those complexities of that time. For instance, there's this document describing a really heated debate in Congress about how to reintegrate the Confederate States. Some were arguing for harsh punishments, others for leniency and reconciliation. It really drives home the fact that the nation was deeply divided, even as the fighting was ending.
Yeah. It makes you think about the weight on Lincoln's shoulders, trying to guide the country towards healing while at the same time dealing with all these threats and challenges. Oh, and speaking of threats, we can't forget about the death threats. Lincoln was receiving threats hidden in fruit baskets. Can you imagine?
Talk about a mixed message, right?
Mhm.
But those threats really underscore a crucial point. Lincoln represented both hope and division. He embodied the potential for a unified nation. But that very hope, that's actually what made him a target for those who just couldn't accept the outcome of the war.
It's kind of hard to imagine that level of animosity, especially during what should have been, well, for a lot of people, a time of celebration. It definitely adds another layer to the story, knowing Lincoln was working under such intense pressure.
Absolutely. And speaking of intense individuals, let's talk about John Wilkes Booth. The sources we have go way beyond just portraying him as, just an assassin.
Yeah.
They paint a much more nuanced picture of his motivations.
Yeah. I never really thought about Booth's personal motivations before looking at these sources, but it seems like his actions were driven by, well, a really complex mix of ideology, ambition, and even this desire for notoriety.
You're exactly right.
Hmm.
One source describes Booth as being totally consumed by this idea of Southern heroism,
Mm,
convinced that what he did would elevate him to like legendary status.
yeah.
It wasn't just about taking Lincoln's life; it was about making a statement. A grand, even if totally misguided, gesture.
It's almost like he was performing a role, even in his own life, which, considering his background in theater, kind of makes sense in a strange way. But this brings up another point. Booth wasn't alone in targeting Lincoln, was he? The sources mention all these other conspiracies during this period.
That's right. There were at least four known plots against Lincoln around this time. Kidnapping attempts, even this crazy plan to infect him with yellow fever. It's chilling to realize how many people were actively trying to hurt or even kill him.
Can you imagine living under that kind of constant threat? It really highlights the dangers of political extremism and how fast it can turn violent. And it makes you wonder, what if one of those other plots had worked? Would history have played out differently?
It's impossible to know for sure, but it's a question worth thinking about. These what ifs force us to really confront how fragile our political systems can be, and how easily things could descend into chaos.
Yeah, that's definitely a sobering thought. But for now, let's get back to Booth. What I found particularly interesting was how much he craved recognition for what he did. He was so sure he'd be hailed as a hero, especially in the South.
And that's what makes the public's reaction to Booth so fascinating. Instead of being celebrated, he was met with, well, just widespread condemnation, even among those who, sympathized with the Confederacy.
It's almost like his actions were so awful, so horrific, that it was a wake-up call for a lot of people, like a
Mhm.
stark reminder of just how devastating hatred and violence can be.
Precisely. It seems Booth really underestimated the public's sense of morality. Even in the middle of such a turbulent time, there was still this collective agreement
Yeah.
that what he did was just completely unacceptable.
Yeah, it really speaks to, this enduring belief in peace and unity, even when faced with such a tragedy. But speaking of the tragedy, we should talk about that night at Ford's Theater. The sources really paint like a very vivid picture of the assassination itself.
Yeah, one source I read went into such detail, like describing the play going on, and then a muffled gunshot, all of a sudden
Mhm.
commotion, and then, this dawning realization that something truly awful had happened. It's almost like you're right there feeling that shock and confusion that must have just like taken over the theater.
And it's important to remember that that while Lincoln's assassination was obviously the main event that night, it wasn't the only act of violence. The attack on Secretary Seward that happened at the same time, it really shows that this was a coordinated attack. Right. It wasn't just about getting rid of Lincoln. It was about like trying to cripple the entire government, trying to throw the country into chaos.
Exactly. One of the sources I found actually had a firsthand account from someone who was at Seward's house that night, and they described the chaos, the struggle, just the sheer brutality of the attack. It's a stark reminder that this wasn't just some political drama playing out. This was real, with real terror and bloodshed.
Yeah. Reading those accounts, you really get a sense of the human cost of these events. It wasn't just about abstract political ideas, but about real people being hurt and lives lost and the impact it had on so many others.
Absolutely. And, while the immediate aftermath of the assassination was full of shock and grief, there was also this nationwide manhunt for Booth and the other conspirators. And the sources really captured the intensity of that pursuit.
It's interesting how the focus shifted so quickly from mourning to this like relentless need for justice. It seems like the nation, while dealing with this trauma, was also determined to hold those responsible accountable.
There's one source that actually includes parts of Booth's diary written while he was on the run. And it's fascinating, to get a glimpse into what he was thinking, his desperation, his growing realization that he wouldn't be seen as a hero after all.
It's strange, to read those words, knowing what he did. It's just a reminder that even people who do terrible things can have, complex and sometimes even contradictory thoughts and feelings.
And I think that's what makes history so compelling. It's not just about dates and names. It's about understanding the people behind those events, their motivations and complexities, even when we might find their actions reprehensible.
That's a good point. It's easy to oversimplify history, to put people into these neat categories of good and bad. But the truth is always more complicated than that. And speaking of complexity, there's one aspect of Lincoln's life that I found really interesting in these sources, and that's the role of faith in his leadership.
Yeah. Lincoln's faith is something that often gets overlooked, but it's clear that it played a big part in how he saw the world and how he approached leadership. Lots of sources mention him reading the Bible every day, his frequent references to Scripture, and his strong belief in divine providence.
Makes you wonder how his faith helped him, how it helped him deal with all the pressure of being president, especially during such a difficult time. Did it give him comfort, guidance, strength, or maybe did it make his decision-making even more complex?
Those are great questions. And unfortunately, we can't really know the answers for sure. But what we can do is look at the evidence and try to figure out how Lincoln's faith might have affected his actions and his legacy. For example, there's this one source that quotes a letter that Lincoln wrote to a friend shortly after his son died.
Oh, wow. I remember reading about that. It must have been, it's an incredibly hard time for him, both personally and as president.
Exactly. And in this letter, you can really see his deep grief, but also this unwavering faith in God's plan, even when faced with such a tremendous loss. It's a really powerful testament to his faith and how it helped him through, just unimaginable hardship.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even, these iconic figures in history were still human. They faced real struggles and found strength in their beliefs. It definitely adds a whole new layer to how we see Lincoln.
Absolutely. It reminds us that history isn't just, these big stories and events, but it's made up of individual lives, each one full of complexities and contradictions and moments of both triumph and tragedy.
Yeah, it's amazing how, digging into those personal details can really change how you see these historical figures. It's like you're suddenly seeing them as real people. But getting back to the assassination, one thing that stood out to me was the public's reaction to Booth. He was so convinced that he'd be seen as a hero, especially in the South.
And yet, if you look at the sources, the exact opposite happened. Instead of the adulation he was expecting, Booth was met with widespread condemnation, even in the South. It seems like what he did was so shocking, so far beyond what people considered acceptable, that it actually, it brought people together against him and the cause he represented.
It makes you wonder if, and this might sound strange, but if Booth's actions actually, in a way, helped to achieve Lincoln's goals of unity and reconciliation. By going so far, by so clearly crossing a line, maybe he inadvertently pushed the nation towards this shared sense of outrage and a desire to to move forward together.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
It's definitely possible that his actions, even though they were meant to divide, actually had the opposite effect.
Yeah.
They forced people to confront the horrors of violence and extremism, and maybe, just maybe, that helped to strengthen this collective desire for peace and healing.
Yeah. It's a reminder that history is full of these unintended consequences, these ripple effects that can be both surprising and really profound. Thinking back on everything we've talked about, it's clear that Lincoln's assassination was, well, it was much more than just a single tragic event. It was a real turning point in American history, and one that we're still feeling the effects of today.
Absolutely. It marked the end of an era and the start of a new one, a period of immense challenges, but also incredible transformation, reconstruction, the process of rebuilding the nation and bringing the South back in. It was a complex and often really difficult process, and it was shaped in large part by Lincoln's legacy and the way he died.
Yeah. It's fascinating to think about how those events still influence how we see American identity,
Yeah.
our political discussions, even our conversations about race and equality.
Lincoln's assassination wasn't just about losing a president, it was about losing a symbol. He represented the possibility of a more unified and just nation.
Yeah.
And his death left this void that took generations to fill. And in many ways, we're still dealing with the consequences of that loss.
It's incredible how one event, one act of violence can have such a lasting impact. It really highlights how connected everything in history is and how much power individuals have to change the course of events.
And maybe even more importantly, it reminds us that even when faced with tragedy and division, there's always hope for healing, for progress, for a better future. It's up to us as individuals and as a society to learn from what happened in the past, to try to understand and reconcile and, to keep working towards a more just and equitable world.
Well said. This deep dive has really given me a lot to think about. It's amazing how much we can learn by exploring the past, especially when we go beyond just the surface level and really dig into the details, the motivations, those human stories that are so often forgotten.
I agree. History is so much more than just dates and facts. It's about human experience,
Yeah.
full of complexity and nuance and lessons that are still relevant today. And by engaging with it, by thinking critically about it, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves, our world, and the possibilities for the future.